Well, good morning. Today we're going to get into a segment that I know a lot of you have been waiting for, and that is Victorian furniture. And Victorian furniture has historically been held in very low regard. And we are going to talk about that, why this happened. Is it justified? Is it not justified? And we're going to look briefly, very briefly, at some of the influences. But Victorian furniture covers roughly a 40-year period in the middle of the 19th century. So the period we're looking at is around 1840 to around 1880. So we'll be right back and we'll get right into it. Okay, 1840. We were at that point, well, not we are Americans. Some of our British cousins were 3 years into the reign of Queen Victoria at that point. She took the throne in 1837. Now, she didn't pass away until 1901, but as we discussed yesterday, 1880s to 1900s, some totally different styles of furniture came to the fore then. The Gothic revival that we saw in Eastlake, Stickley, Mission, the arts and crafts, even Art Nouveau was coming in. So Victorian furniture was passing out of fashion before the end of Queen Victoria's reign. So what we're looking at is roughly the middle portion of the 19th century, 1840 to 1880. Now, I know that's a long span, but things changed very slowly in those days. Without mass communication as we know it today, ideas didn't travel as far as fast as they do now, which is not to say that there were not styles that came out during this period. They were just not the predominant style. So let's start with 1840 and look at where Victorian furniture came from. And where it came from is simple. France. You can see the Rococo influences, very ornate, heavily carved, fussy. Rococo, by the way, comes from the French word for shell, and it's because shell motifs were often carved in these pieces. And I always think of it in terms of those little projects kids make at summer camp when they glue macaroni to a cigar box and spray paint it and say, "Here, Mom, a jewelry box for you." That to me is Rococo, gluing a whole bunch of stuff down, spray painting it gold, and saying, "Here, this is art." Yeah, well, bless their little 6-year-old hearts, it's not art. That was the main influence of Victorian. The furniture that had gone before was, although by no means simple, was not as wildly ornate as we will see. The ornate, heavily carved, over-frilly, overdone, fussy nature of Victorian is one of the things that kept it in low regard and still does to some extent. Another, and we touched on this briefly when we were discussing the differences between antique, vintage, and retro. If you'll recall, I mentioned that there was a glitch in the way the law defining antique furniture was written. And instead of saying anything more than 100 years old is antique, they fixed it in time. And so the way it was actually interpreted was anything older than 100 years before that law was written, which was, I believe, in the 1930s, was antique. thereby icing Victorian furniture out of the antique category for a number of years until the law was changed, which was inevitable because it was a mistake. It was not the intent of the lawmakers, but because that was the law, Victorian was out of the loop for a period. That certainly contributed to it. The furniture that preceded Victorian in England was the furniture of Duncan Fife, of Hepplewhite, of Sheridan, Chippendale even. Chippendale was more ornate than the others. Beautiful, clean lines, just gorgeous pieces of furniture. We will get into that. These things were and still are amazing. You can look at a piece of Hepplewhite furniture today and say, wow, that's modern. That's just, ooh, so sleek. And in fact, we're talking about a piece of furniture that was more than 200 years old. Victorian was very different. And as I mentioned before, people tend to run away from the previous styles. It's not like they're looking for something, it's they're rejecting what came before. And with mass production techniques and the ability to create something very ornate and very fussy and very pretty and very frilly, people just jumped on it. Now, is all Victorian furniture very fussy and mass-produced and cheap and sleazy? Of course not. So what we are going to look at today is the high end of Victorian furniture. And it's not coming from England. Victorian furniture at its apex was being made in the workshops of John Henry Belter. He was a German immigrant to the United States. He was an American citizen, so boy, we get to take credit for him. John Henry Belter developed a technique for laminating thin strips of rosewood, which is a beautiful wood with a wonderful reddish tint to it. It looks a lot like mahogany, and he could laminate it and get these great curves through the lamination process. And then this wonderfully curved wood could then be ornately carved, and the pieces that came from Belter's workshop were staggeringly beautiful. These pieces today are in museums, and most of what I am going to show you are straight from museums. This is Victorian furniture at its very best. So let's take a look. John Henry Belter. Astounding, isn't it? Now, that furniture, when they made living room sets, living room suites, these sets of furniture were enormous. They would ordinarily consist of a sofa, maybe two sofas, a settee, maybe two settees, a couple of chairs, one of which would have been an armchair. That was the man's chair. Another chair that either had no arms or was a lower armchair for the lady. And we will get into why that happened. Anywhere from 4 to 16 side chairs, a massive central table, because if you'll recall, they had that central table in the middle of the room. We saw that 2 days ago when we were looking at pictures of furniture from the early 20th century. They still had that table in the middle of the room, their Victorian legacy. That was a work table. These tables were anywhere from 4 to 8 feet across. Massive. Sometimes they had marble tops. The amount of furniture in a suite of Victorian parlor furniture was just mind-boggling. Now, of course, this was not furniture for the average home. Most of us, given that furniture in our present homes, even if we scattered it around, wouldn't have enough room for it. We'd be stacking chairs up in the back hall. This was furniture for the upper classes. There was not much by way of middle class homes in 1840, 1850. The divide between the wealthy and the poor was pretty sharp. There was not a lot of middle ground. So when we see furniture like the Belcher pieces, this was not furniture that was going to show up in a working class household. Not at all. Not even the smallest of the pieces. So these were huge, elaborate sets of furniture, wonderfully, intricately carved, just staggering. When you look at something like that, you can see why Victorian furniture has its fans. You can see why these pieces belong in museums. They were, in fact, just works of art. So, that was our stuff. Now, how did we cope with it? Well, if you were a woman, that presented a lot of problems, because women back in the middle of the 19th century were wearing hoop skirts. Now, I'm sure you think that's all exaggeration, that it couldn't possibly have been this voluminous hoops. Oh yeah, it was. And we're going to take a look at that. I have always wondered how the devil they got through the doors in those skirts, because those hoops were rigid. A lot of times the supporting structure was metal. This was not just tons of flouncy fabric. Oh no. These women had bird cages tied around their waist and skirts that just piled over it, and with skirts that were 4, 5, 6 feet wide. No idea how they got through the doorway. You would have to grab one end of the skirt, hold it up like you were holding up a hula hoop, sort of shimmy sideways through the door, drop it back down, and hope that you weren't showing your underwear to everybody in sight. Well, that set of armchairs I was talking about Papa and his armchair with the arms, well, Mother wasn't going to be sitting in that, because it would have been difficult enough to get her hoop-skirted butt into any kind of chair at all. Certainly not an armchair. That was not going to happen. So that was one of the practical reasons that women's chairs had lower arms. They also had lower backs, and I think that was just a reflection of the sexism at the time. What can I say? But when we look at how this furniture was used, we can't simply do it in a vacuum. So let's take a quick look at the hoop skirt. It's a wonder women could even walk in these skirts. I truly do not know how they sat down. Now I know it doesn't speak well for me. It's just too much time on my hands. I've actually wondered about that. I have thought to myself, if I had something like that, how could I sit on a chair? And ottomans and poops were very big during that period. And I have to think a lot of women simply went over to the ottoman, lifted the skirt, sat down and dropped the skirt over the ottoman or the poop. I can only imagine that's how they did it. Otherwise, if you actually tried to sit down in a chair, that hoop would be up in front of you and everything you had would be on display for anybody who wanted to see it. Now, of course, fortunately, they had like 19 layers of highly frilly, lacy underclothes, which certainly had to be the result of those hoops occasionally flopping in the breeze and showing what they shouldn't be showing. But it truly boggles the mind. By the way, if any of you have any theories on that, I'd love to hear it, because the practicality of walking around in a skirt like that has just, the mechanics eludes me. These were people who traveled in carriages that I've seen. You can see them in museums, that they were not big enough to accommodate those skirts. Thinking, yes, you throw a person in. You put that skirt in alone and you couldn't fit another human in there. I don't even think you could fit the whole skirt in there. So I don't know how they did it. And if any of you know, I'd love it if you'd share it with me, because it does keep me up nights wondering. So that is the hoop skirt dilemma. Now, clearly, people who were dressed like that were not lounging about on this furniture. I question whether or not they were even sitting on it at all. I'm just not sure how that could have happened. And I suspect that the ornate carving, the fact that they were not comfortable, they were horsehair and slick. You could just slide right off them. I question if anybody ever even really sat on this stuff. And I suspect that at least some portion of it was just for show, because it's among the most uncomfortable furniture out there. There's no give. It's like sitting on a rock. I've sat on rocks. I think rocks are more comfortable. That was the style. And over time, that style became copied out by, I was about to say craftsman, but that's wrong. Belter was a craftsman. He was, in fact, a well-skilled and trained cabinet maker. It went into mass production, and consequently, the beauty of it was stripped away. And as Charles Eastlake complained, uh, basically the function was gone. The form that was all that was left. It was just not practical furniture. And by the time it hit mass production, uh, the beauty was getting stripped aside, and you were left with uncomfortable furniture. Okay, the furniture that I'm going to show you next has not been cherry-picked to show you the tawdry end of Victorian. This is just ordinary, middle-of-the-road Victorian furniture. It would not have been in the households of the lower classes. This still would have been in the households of the upper classes, just not the upper classes. This furniture is nice, but you're going to see a difference between this and the Belter. So let's take a look at ordinary Victorian furniture. This furniture, too, may well have been sold in suites consisting of sofas, chairs, side chairs. All of them would have had that large central table, because in the 19th century, the parlor was formed around that table. These tables were large enough that we would consider them dining tables. These were the work tables, and we discussed this previously. This is where the women of the house did their sewing, their mending, their embroidery, and in some cases, their coping, making, giant cabinets. And we've talked about that. Some of the things these women were doing was just absolutely beyond belief. They were hobby craftsmen, craftswomen, who were creating just everything from doilies to furniture to armoires. I mean, really large pieces of furniture. They were painting, they were sculpting, all kinds of things. So that was their work table, and that's where they were doing it. Now, these large central tables still come to us right up until the early part of the 20th century, until we actually move from parlor to living room. Still have that table. There were other tables, smaller tables, side tables. There were candle stands, which were side tables that were approximately 12 to 18 inches on the top, that were designed to hold lamps or candles. They had other pieces of furniture. They had fire screens and things that we simply don't have anymore. So that was the way the Victorians were living. Heavily upholstered, fringe on everything, more draperies than you could shake a stick at, because there was no central heating, and they had to block off the windows. In the 19th century, glassmaking had improved. With the improvement in glassmaking came larger windows, the ability to look out on the world, which was not present in earlier homes. But those windows had to be covered in the winter because they were just not weather tight. So masses of curtains, and you would have the lace curtain and the drapery and a shutter or a blind, all this stuff covering the windows. They had special curtains called portieres that covered the doorways so you could close them up. And it was simply to keep the heat in. It's just purely practical. And modern central heating made some big changes in the way we lived, as did things like electricity, uh, as we spoke much later, was television. But the biggest change at the end of the 19th century was central heating. That was the period when the heavy draperies could start to get set aside. They were more there for show than for the function of keeping rooms warm. So that is Victorian furniture. Now, next week, we are going to go back to our old format, and we're going to do Saturdays are going to be informational, Sundays are going to be projects, but I am reserving Mondays for the continuation of this series. And the reason I'm doing this is because the questions that are coming in about buying and selling online, which is something that has been neglected while we've been doing this series, those questions are piling up. They need to get answered. So we need to go back to our more informational videos, include some of those. And of course, the project requests are building up too. So we've gone through 200 years, and starting next week, we're still going to do this. We're just going to do this one day a week. So a week from today, that is Monday, we are going to go into some of those early 19th century styles, Chippendale, Sheridan, Happlewhite, Duncan Fife, that I mentioned. And we're going to do that in the context of a very special video that I will be showing in the middle of my regular videos. So we're going to start off, we're going to have a little video, we're going to talk about it, we're going to move on. It should be fun. All right, have a terrific week. I will see you all next Saturday. Next Saturday, we are going to discuss buying and selling online, what to look for when you are making your purchases for resale. Have a good week. I'll see you Saturday.